Thank you very much, Cameron, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak today, RDA. Some of you will be aware that this is the third time I've spoken at this event, and I've had a long-standing association with Peter Tragilgis, the CEO of RDA Mid North Coast. And so Peter came to me with an instruction about this conference. He said, well, what I really want you to do is I want you to sort of pull it all together, place it within context, add some academics to it, and make reference back to what we did the previous 2 years. And I thought, right, that's going to be real easy. That's what I thought. But I'm having a crack at it. And so what I want to try and do today is to pull up some of these themes. Here we go. What I want to do is pull up some of these themes around leadership and regions that we've discussed in the previous two conferences to provide the context and to remind us as a group what it is that leadership can be about in regions, why it's important, and to a certain extent why it's often overlooked within public debate around the future of regions. And so I want to talk about leadership, I want to talk about why it matters, I want to talk about how it can be expressed, and I want to talk about some recent work by the OECD on what they refer to as conditionality. And one of the great things about the OECD is they make up their own language. So if you ask a question in an OECD conference, it's actually called an intervention. So only that and the UN are the only two places in the world where they refer to a question as an intervention. But maybe it's part of the simultaneous translation from English into French, into Maltese, into Finnish. And then I want to talk about the leadership relay and remind those of us who are at previous conferences and perhaps those who weren't there about some of the previous discussions around leadership presented by some of our earlier speakers, particularly Markus Sotaratu and, of course, Chris Collinge from Britain. And then I want to talk about socially embedded leaders, and this is some work that's recently been undertaken by a colleague of mine, Christine Peters, and what those sorts of insights can tell us in terms of this ongoing debate around leadership in regions, particularly places such as Australia. So, what is leadership and why does it matter? Well, I think this image for me really captures to a great degree one of the key issues around leadership. And it's a silo. And one of the great challenges confronting regions and their development is what's often referred to as the silo mentality of governments. A region has a need, but often that need doesn't necessarily fit neatly into government programs. How many people here think of themselves as active in the regional development space? Put your hand up if you don't mind. Yeah, quite a few. And you would often find that you can identify a problem, an issue, and you can go to a government department or a council and say, well, actually, we want some assistance in addressing this problem. But they say, actually, what we can give you is money for this, and we can give you money for that, but we can't give you money for that because that doesn't fit within my portfolio. Who's had that experience? Yeah. And so we can't break down these silos. We can't move away from these silos because we have a system of government which is very tightly controlled from the top. It's obsessed about accountability. For God's sake, don't spend education money on employment training programs. For God's sake, don't spend environment money on providing housing, even though you might need to accommodate an environmental worker. So leadership is about finding ways to break down these barriers. Leadership is about ways of taking the silo mentality and turning it into a more holistic picture. And this is not a problem unique to Australia. In some ways, I think the problem is more acute in Australia because of the nature of the relationships between the federal government and the state government and local governments. You know, the greatest thing you can ever do is try and get the state government to address something they think is a federal problem or a local government to address something they think is a state problem. And also by our Westminster system of government, which keeps individual ministers accountable. So it's a bigger problem in Australia, I think, in many other nations, but in fact, it's a problem in most parts of the developed world with strong systems of government, because we have strong systems of government which then impose these rigid silos. So I just refer to two publications. One's by the OECD, Breaking Out of Policy Silos, Doing More with Less, how you can get around these issues of very rigid barriers. Better stop doing that. And then the second one is actually a Swedish publication, and I won't even try and pronounce the name of the government department that produced it, but it's about joining up for regional development. How do you get past what's often referred to as this wicked problem of regional development and overcoming silos? And that was an interesting project, actually, the Joining Up for Regional Development, because they actually toured the world looking for solutions to how other jurisdictions actually solve this issue. So, one of my key messages here is that leadership actually matters, because if we leave it to government, there is no solution. Often if we intervene with government, there is no solution, but if we leave it to government, there is no solution, because they will deliver on time, every time. Like Mitchell Starc bowling at an opposition batsman. He'll place the ball every time where he's scheduled to place the ball. But they won't necessarily move around and find alternative solutions to actually address the need at the regional scale. And that's the real challenge in terms of government. So leadership matters because it finds solutions that really work in that place. And that's what the OECD refers to as conditionality. And the OECD says there's a range of solutions to regional problems, but you've got to match the right solution to the right location. So one of the solutions to the problems of regional development is that you encourage more people to get an education. You encourage more people to go to university. But as the OECD points out, in some regions that can actually have a very perverse effect, because what it does is it encourages the best and the brightest in the region to go to university and then leave. Conditionality, as a principle, says, well, actually what you do is you encourage the acquisition of vocational skills in that region, the retention of vocational skills in that region, and then they stay in that region and work and see that region prosper. So it's about matching the solution to the needs of the region or to the nature of the problem. So the leadership relay, this is an important part of the story here, and it's about the work of Markku Sotaratu, who comes from the University of Tampere in Finland, and he's got a conference running in May if anyone's interested in Tampere. And Markku's spoken here twice, and essentially one of his key messages is about the leadership relay. And one of the things he says about the leadership relay is, if we look at successful innovation, and he gives a lovely story about the bionic jaw, and who's heard it? Anyone here? No? Anyway, he gives a lovely story about the bionic jaw, where he points out that the development of world-leading technology using stem cells to grow parts of the human body, including growing part of the jaw in a person's stomach, was made possible by a sequence of actors bringing about change and taking on responsibility for leading an initiative over an extended period of time. At one stage it was the regional development practitioners, at one stage it was the university, at one stage it was government agency, at one stage it was doctors, and at one stage it was regional development practitioners again. So leadership is not a one-off event, it's a relay. It has different roles and it has different consequences in terms of outcomes. And that's something I want to come back to in a little while. And the other part of the story really relates to some of the work or some of the discussion that my colleague Chris Collinge from Birmingham University discussed at the very first of these conferences. And in his presentation, he talked about the Öresund, and forgive me, my Swedish is terrible. The Öresund is essentially the region in this map. I think I might have a little pointer thing. This region here between southern Sweden and Denmark. And the key thing about the Öresund is this bridge. So essentially they built a bridge, including a railway component, which allows commuting between southern Sweden and Denmark. And what's significant about the Öresund? The Öresund is significant because it's the basis for a lot of the pharmaceuticals industry in the developed world. There's only 3 or 4 places in the developed world which really have substantial pharmaceutical industries. One part is in the US, of course, particularly around San Diego. parts of Boston. But the Orosund is in fact one of the key pharmaceutical clusters in the world. If you've ever seen a drug company called AstraZeneca, they're based in this region. And one of the key issues is, of course, that like any set of private companies, they compete with each other fiercely. But like any other set of private companies, they also recognise that on occasion collaboration is very important. But how do you trust your collaborators? Always the key issue. And one of the lessons that they came out with is, in fact, what they do in the Orosund is they have a meeting, they come together, they share interests, they discuss ideas, and they have a meeting that is chaired by and facilitated by the universities in that region. And this method of collaboration has generated substantial benefits in terms of achieving a greater impact on their research spend, because of course research is fundamental to the growth of the pharmaceuticals industry. So collaboration with an institutional actor actually results in better outcomes. Moving beyond the private sector into an institutional space is positive. And of course, by working with an institution such as universities, and there are a number of universities in the region who rotate through the chairing role, by taking that approach, what they find is they achieve continuity. They achieve a relay effect as individuals take on roles over time and individual institutions take on role over time. The universities effectively act as an honest broker, but also they act to ensure longevity. Some of these universities have been going since the 14th century. They're likely to be around for a little while yet. Many of these companies will not. And that then leads me on to my next set of insights, which is about socially embedded leadership. And this comes from the work of a colleague of mine, Christine Peters, in South Australia. And one of the things that she noted is an insight that came from her work into understanding about how small businesses in Australia take on environmental messages. So how does the guy who runs a small garage take on an environmental message? Such as, it's not a real good idea to pour that stuff down the drain anymore. Or how do they take on a message about, well, actually recycle your product? Or how do they take on a message about, let's reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, or let's take up carbon accounting as part of our normal business process and see what efficiency dividends it drives? And one of the challenges is that often when we get these messages, they come from on high. They come from a politician, they come from a senior executive, they often even come from an academic about what you should do. But what we know from the literature on the take-up of environmental initiatives is that in fact take-up is very, very slow, and rates of belief in these sorts of initiatives can actually be quite low. So she studied business associations, and she looked at business associations, some of which actually had a very positive role in terms of addressing environmental issues, and others did not. And what she concluded is that, in fact, change in terms of environmental practices, environmental thoughts, in these sorts of small businesses didn't come from these conventional leaders as we understand them, the office holders, the politician or whatever, the technical expert, but they actually came from over here, what she refers to as the socially embedded leader. So what's a socially embedded leader? A socially embedded leader is the bloke, it's the woman you trust. It's the person you've had dealings with over time. It's someone who has spent a great deal of time and has a lot of validity within the local community.